Welcome back, students. In this video, we're going to look at some of the intellectual successes of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate is very successful in connecting the learning of Roman, Persian, and Indian cultures and uniting them all together in Baghdad. We see that Arab and Islamic architecture that you see depicted here on the far right of the screen is going to combine the Roman emphasis on open space with the Persian emphasis on gracious curves. We're going to see Islamic society as a center for disseminating new technologies in ceramics for multiple firings and incorporating multiple colors into pottery. Papermaking is adopted from as far away as China. Advances in irrigation and agriculture, like the windmill, like the importing of citrus fruits into Spain, these are also disseminated across the region that's been united under Islamic rule. And Baghdad becomes the largest, the wealthiest, and the most important city in the world. And this was very much a planned cultural flowering. In the year 830, the caliphs established the House of Wisdom. That's one of your key words for this week. The significance of the House of Wisdom is that it is the largest library or research center, research institution in the world. We know that people came from all over the world, came from Europe, came from the Byzantine Empire, came from India, came from China in order to study there. The House of Wisdom is the center of the success of the Islamic civilization in preserving and expanding the learning of Western civilization. We know that the caliphs sponsor the translations of works from Persia, India, China, Rome, and Greece. All of these great texts, all of these sources of knowledge in this world come to Baghdad. All of them are translated into Arabic. If you speak Arabic, if you're part of the Islamic world, even if you're only a visitor, as long as you speak Arabic, you have access to the great texts of all these different civilizations. We know that in one text, or in one instance, when the Byzantines and the Abbasids were agreeing a peace treaty, one of the terms of the treaty was that the Byzantines would lend the Abbasids a certain book from ancient Greece. So it shows that the Abbasids really liked their learning, really liked their books. That's part of a military treaty. Now, the Muslims at this time were less interested in Greek and Latin poetry and literature. The literature that they choose is Arabian literature and Persian literature. But they are extremely interested in Greek achievements in science and mathematics. And without Islamic reproductions, these aspects of the knowledge of ancient and Greek worlds would almost certainly have been lost. So we know that many Greek texts were translated into Arabic by Greek-speaking Nestorian Christians. Now we come back to those great Christian controversies. And the Nestorians, if you remember, were driven out of the Roman Empire. And so you have this group of Christians living in the Persian Empire. Now they're living under the rule of the Abbasids, but they still speak Greek because Greek is the language of their liturgies. They're able to translate these ancient texts into Arabic. We're told that around 800 doctors were living and doing medical research in Baghdad at this time. Meanwhile, in the fields of mathematics, Islamic developments are led by a man named Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi pioneered the use of Arabic numerals, which have their origins in Indian civilization. Try doing long division or long multiplication with Roman numerals. You'll see why the use of Arabic numerals for mathematics was a great advance. He also introduced concepts like zero and decimal points and the use of algebra. Algebra, of course, is an Islamic word, or is an Arabic word, has a descendant from an Arabic word. Later, Arab mathematicians working under the Abbasids will develop concepts like square roots and other geometric properties. We also see the development of star tables, so more precise astronomical observation. Why is this important? It's important because it supports more precise navigation at sea, but also because, like all religions at this time, the practice of Islam is very much dependent on an accurate measurement of time. You have to be able to say when Ramadan is going to occur. It hasn't been calculated for you. So you need to be able to understand the movements of the stars, how they correlate to days and to a calendar, and how this shapes when Ramadan is going to be, when the other Islamic holy days are going to be throughout the year. The Abbasids were also interested in Greek philosophy. This leads to some of their greatest achievements, but also reveals some of their most important limitations. Early philosophers still used Plato. Philosophers like Al-Farabi theorized an ideal state just like that was theorized by Plato in his Republic, his famous allegory of the cave, but within an Islamic context. What would this look like if everyone was practicing the religion of Islam? Avicenna developed commentaries on logic, ethics, metaphysics. But the great contribution of Islamic philosophers was the preservation of Aristotle, and the great philosophers Aristotle's contribution to Western and Islamic thought. At this time, the Byzantine Empire and medieval Europe, although medieval Europe was not very literate, but in that it was, they were interested in Plato. Because what does Plato teach about mostly? He teaches about the relationship between the body and the spirit. And this is what was most interesting to these people at this time. It is only because of text, the reproduction of text in the Arabic world, that Aristotle's philosophy still survives today. Now, Arabs valued Aristotle as a scientist and a thinker about the biological world in a way that Plato was not. Plato had little interest in the natural world. Plato was interested in the human mind and the human spirit. Aristotle might be said to be a rational empiricist. Aristotle's overarching argument, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm putting this in gross overgeneralizations, but it is that the world makes sense rationally, and that includes religion. Aristotle says you can look at the world, you can see an order in the world. God was the great mechanic who made this organized machine. He built this machine, he flipped the on switch, and he set it in motion. Now, what's interesting here is that the God, or God as Aristotle understands him, is not typically how God is understood in the barbarian kingdoms of the medieval West that we discussed 2 weeks ago. Remember, Clovis is in a battle and he's praying that God's going to help him, and God helps him and he wins the battle, and so he converts. Aristotle's God isn't doing that. Aristotle's God might make sure the Earth doesn't totally spin off its orbit into outer space, but he's not worried about a particular battle that Clovis is fighting. It's also, God, as Aristotle describes him, is also not the God of Muhammad, who's coming down into Arabia and revealing himself to Muhammad, who's fighting with the Muslim armies. It's not really that God either. Instead, Aristotle's influence is going to encourage thinkers from Judaism, and Christianity, and Islam to propose that God is a rational companion to man. And in the Islamic world, this is going to create some problems. Now, this dissemination begins with a Jew named Moses Maimonides, who brings Aristotle's text from Egypt to Spain, and then from Averroes, who was an Islamic philosopher in Spain. And so, influenced by Aristotle, philosophers like Averroes embraced the position that faith and reason, what we believe and what we come to understand and know through our senses, that these were complementary. That they're all part, belief in God, knowledge of the natural world, they complement each other. They don't contradict each other. You can have both and it makes sense. However, the idea that God is man's rational companion, who informs human beings about themselves through the natural world, which is what Aristotle is teaching, is utterly toxic in Islam. So Aristotle's influence is encouraging philosophers like Averroes to teach We can look at the world looks ordered, we understand what's good through looking at the world. That gives us an idea of what, so that means there had to be a maker of this world. When we look at the way the world is organized, that teaches us what God should be like. But for Muslims, God is not related to man. Remember, this was the whole problem of the great Christian debates, Arianism and Oppositism, Nestorianism, that we discussed a few weeks ago, that Muhammad was trying to cut through. Muhammad said, God is totally and utterly different from human beings. He is not your companion. He is your master. And so Averroes is condemned as trying to learn without consulting revelation. His books are burned. Many other Islamic philosophers are condemned as heretics. And so this is the great limitation of the otherwise amazing intellectual achievements of the Islamic world at this time. And it's actually going to be pretty disastrous if the study of religion is not seen as compatible with the study of the natural world. It means that in the end, the study of knowledge is only going to be useful insofar as it's used for practicing religion. So you study astronomy so that you can predict the lunar months, so that you can construct the observation of Islam over a year. But you're not going to construct massive telescopes purely so you can understand the natural world, because understanding the natural world is a good thing, because that leads you closer to God. That's not what the mainstream religious view of Islam is teaching at all. And so this is part of the reason why, in the end, despite its great intellectual successes, despite its great intellectual contribution to the history of Western civilization, in the end, Islamic culture is going to be, or at least the intellectual component of Islamic culture, is going to be overtaken by technological developments in the West. And we're going to end there for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this material and hope to see you in the discussion soon.